The roads going into Mobile, Alabama in 1842 were dusty dirt paths leading into a busy port city where cotton was everything and rich people made their money off the backs of people who had no say in the matter. The breeze off the Gulf smelled like salt and cash, covering up something much darker hiding underneath all that fancy Southern politeness. It was right here, in a big white house with tall columns on Government Street, that the story we're about to get into actually happened. A story that stayed buried in city records and old letters for over 100 years. According to courthouse papers dug up during building renovations in 1967, Anne Brennan was just 23 years old when she married James Delacqua, a rich plantation owner who was 30 years older than her. The Delacqua family was one of the oldest in Mobile, going all the way back to the original French settlers. James owned 3 cotton plantations spread across Alabama and Mississippi. You could see his wealth in the big 3-story mansion that looked out over Mobile Bay. What people didn't talk about much in public was how all that money was actually made, on the work of over 200 enslaved people who labored on the Delacqua lands. Church records from St. Mary's Catholic Church show that James and Anne got married in 1837 in a big fancy ceremony attended by all of Mobile's most important people. Anne came from a regular family. Her dad was a clerk at the Port Authority, and how exactly she caught the eye of one of Mobile's richest bachelors was something everyone gossiped about. Some said it was because she was really beautiful, fair-skinned with auburn hair. Others thought it was more of a business deal. A letter found among the belongings of Josephine Harris, Anne's childhood friend, hinted at something else entirely. Anne told her that she felt like she had been sold just as surely as any piece of property that changes hands at the marketplace. The letter reads, "Her father's debts were pretty bad, and Mr. Delacqua has kindly offered to pay them off in exchange for her hand in marriage. She cries when she thinks nobody's looking." The wedding happened anyway, and Anne took her spot in Mobile society as Mrs. James Delacqua. For 5 years she did everything expected of a plantation mistress, hosting dinners, running the household staff, and showing up at her husband's side at all the social events. According to the diary of Margaret Thornton, wife of the local bank president, Anne was always dressed perfectly but had this strange quietness about her that some people mistook for being stuck up. Her eyes, though, showed a deep sadness that no fancy silk dress could hide. Among the Delacqua household workers was a man named Isaiah Bennett. According to property records from 1835, Isaiah was bought by James Delacqua at an auction in New Orleans for the very high price of $1,800. The receipt described him as 25 years old, able to read and write, experienced as a house servant, and good at carpentry. What made Isaiah stand out was his special status in the household. James had made him his personal valet, a job that gave him privileges that other enslaved people didn't have. Isaiah went everywhere with James, handled his letters and business correspondence, and even traveled with him to business meetings in New Orleans and Charleston. A note in James's business ledger, found among papers donated to the Mobile Historical Society in 1954, showed that Isaiah had been secretly taught to read and write by a northern tutor James had hired while pretending the man was just there to manage his accounts. This was, of course, completely against Alabama state law, which made it illegal to educate enslaved people. Things at the Delacqua mansion took a dramatic turn in February 1842. According to the Mobile Register's obituary section, James Delacqua suddenly died at the age of 53. The cause listed was apoplexy, which today we'd call a stroke or heart attack. He collapsed in his study late one evening with only Isaiah there with him when it happened. The newspaper noted that Mr. Delacqua's trusted servant called the doctor and Mrs. Delacqua, but nothing could be done to save the gentleman. What happened after James died was very different from what everyone expected. According to his will, filed with the Mobile County Probate Court, Anne was set to inherit everything, the mansion, the plantations, and all property, which was the polite word for the human beings James owned. That part wasn't unusual for the time. What was unusual was an extra addition to the will made just 3 months before James died, saying that Isaiah Bennett was to be set free, legally freed, and given a small piece of land on the edge of the Delacqua property, along with $500 in cash. This extra part of the will made the people handling the estate raise their eyebrows. Why would James Delacqua, a man who built his whole fortune on enslaved labor, single out one specific person to receive freedom and money? That question came up in the letters between Thomas Bradford, James's lawyer, and William Harrison, the man managing the estate. There are whispers of something improper that I dare not put in writing, Bradford wrote in March of 1842. Let's just say that Mr. Delacroix may have had reasons to make sure Bennet was taken care of that go beyond a normal master and servant relationship. Anne observed a brief mourning period and then started making decisions that totally shocked Mobile society. According to property records filed in May 1842, she sold 2 of the 3 Delacroix plantations along with most of the enslaved workers to a group of buyers from Mississippi. She kept only the Mobile mansion and a small farm outside the city, where she moved the remaining household staff. It was during this time that the relationship between Anne and Isaiah started to change in ways that the people around them definitely noticed. Eliza Johnson, who worked as a cook in the Delacroix household, later gave a statement to the Works Progress Administration Federal Writers Project in 1937 when she was over 90 years old. Her testimony, recorded by a fieldworker named Sarah Collins, gives us a rare peek into what was happening in that household. Miss Anne, she start to ask Mr. Isaiah to take his meals in the small dining room instead of the kitchen with the rest of us, Johnson remembered. Then she have him sit with her in the library evenings reading books. Folks in the house, we know something ain't right, but ain't nobody going to say nothing, not our place. But people in town, they start to talk when they see him riding beside her in the carriage, not driving it like he's supposed to. The biggest bombshell came in September of 1842, 7 months after James Delacroix's death. According to a letter written by Reverend Michael O'Connor of a small Methodist church outside Mobile, he performed a marriage ceremony between a recently widowed wealthy lady and a free man of color who had formerly worked in her household. Even though the letter didn't name Anne and Isaiah directly, the timing and all the details make it pretty clear who the couple was. The marriage was, of course, illegal under Alabama law. Interracial marriage was banned throughout the South, with serious punishments for anyone who dared to do it. The fact that Anne and Isaiah even found a minister willing to perform the ceremony at all is pretty incredible. The Reverend's letter, found among church records during a 1963 archive project, shows he knew exactly what he was doing. I performed this union fully knowing the earthly consequences I might face, he wrote, but I answer to a higher authority than the laws of men. Their love for each other was obvious, and I couldn't in good conscience deny them the blessing they were asking for. News of the marriage spread fast through Mobile society. The reaction was quick and brutal. According to City Council minutes from October 1842, a committee of concerned citizens petitioned to have Anne removed from the Delacroix property on grounds of immoral behavior and violating public decency. The petition was signed by 42 prominent Mobile residents, including several people who had been sitting at Anne's dinner table just months earlier. What happened next has been pieced together from scattered bits and pieces of records. The Mobile Sheriff's Daily Log has an entry from October 12, 1842, sent deputies to the Delacroix residence on Government Street following reports of unlawful cohabitation. Upon arrival, found the house completely empty. Signs suggest a hurried departure. A notice placed in the Mobile Register on October 20th offered a $500 reward for information about the whereabouts of Isaiah Bennet, a Negro man fraudulently claiming freedom, and Anne Delacroix, widow believed to be traveling in his company. The notice was placed by William Harrison, the person managing James Delacroix's estate, who claimed that Anne had run off with valuables belonging to the estate, and that Isaiah had manipulated a grieving woman in a vulnerable state. After that, the trail completely goes cold. There is no record of Anne or Isaiah ever being caught and no sign that they were ever found. Their disappearance became the subject of tons of speculation. Some people thought they'd run to New Orleans, where a community of free people of color and more relaxed social rules might have offered them some cover. Others thought they'd gone north to Boston or even Canada. A darker theory whispered in private letters between the sheriff and the mayor was that some people unwilling to let such a brazen violation of social rules go unpunished had taken matters into their own hands. In 1867, 25 years after they disappeared, a strange document showed up in a Cincinnati probate court. A woman named Anne Bennet, described as a fair-skinned widow, had died of consumption, leaving a modest estate to her son James. The document mentioned that Anne had come to Cincinnati in 1843 with her husband Isaiah, who had built a successful carpentry business before his death in 1859. While there's no rock-solid proof that the Anne and Isaiah Bennet of Cincinnati were the same Anne and Isaiah who fled Mobile, the coincidence is pretty hard to ignore. The most interesting piece of evidence came to light in 1958 when a family Bible was donated to the Mobile Historical Society by a woman who said she was a distant relative of the Delacqua family. The Bible had a family tree in it with an entry for Anne Delacqua that listed her death as unknown. Right next to it, written in a different handwriting and different ink, was a tiny note, "Found peace at last." Whether that was just wishful thinking on someone's part or based on actual knowledge that nobody recorded, we'll never know. What drove Anne to make such a drastic choice? The few personal papers that survived offer some really fascinating clues. A page from what looks like Anne's diary, preserved in the Mobile Historical Society archives, has this passage from January 1842, just 1 month before James died. "I cannot continue to live this way. Surrounded by suffering I am powerless to fix. James grows more distant every day, retreating into his ledgers and his whiskey. Only Isaiah sees me as I truly am, sees the cage I live in, gilded though it may be. We spoke today of places far from here where people might live differently. It was just talk, dreams that dissolve in the light of day, but for a moment I could breathe." The relationship between Anne and Isaiah raises really deep questions about power, personal choice, and the possibility of real human connection across the brutal divides of the antebellum South. As a young woman essentially sold into marriage to pay off her family's debts, Anne experienced her own kind of bondage, different from Isaiah's enslavement, but running on a similar kind of powerlessness. Did they find in each other a recognition of shared humanity that went beyond the roles society had forced on them, or was their relationship itself shaped by the deeply unequal power dynamics of the world they lived in? Some historians have suggested that Anne's decision to free and then marry Isaiah was an act of rebellion against the same system that had kept her own life so constrained. Others raise the harder question of whether Isaiah, despite his unusual education and status, could ever have truly freely chosen a relationship with someone who had until very recently held legal ownership of him. These questions can't be definitively answered with the limited evidence we have, but they remind us of the complicated human realities that existed inside systems of oppression. The Delacqua mansion still stands on Government Street in Mobile, though it's changed hands many times since 1842. According to local legend, visitors sometimes report hearing quiet conversations coming from empty rooms or seeing the figure of a woman in 19th-century dress looking out from the third-floor windows. Skeptics say these stories are just the natural creaks and shadows of an old house, made spookier by knowing the history. What can't be argued is that the walls of that house witnessed a relationship that totally defied the rigid rules of its time. The story of Anne Delacqua and Isaiah Bennett has mostly faded from public memory. It lives on now mainly in scattered documents and the whispered stories passed down by people who worked hard to preserve Mobile's complicated history. Their fate, whether they found the freedom they were searching for or paid a terrible price for breaking the rules, is still unknown. What survives is the echo of a choice made against overwhelming odds, a choice that shows both how rigid the rules of history were and how persistently people tried to fight against them. In 1966, during the height of the civil rights movement, a graduate student at Howard University named Marcus Johnson wrote a thesis on interracial relationships in the antebellum South. In his conclusion, he reflected on Anne and Isaiah's story. Their choices can't be romanticized or oversimplified. They lived in a time of profound moral contradictions, and we can't know the full complexity of their motives or feelings. What we do know is that they looked at the world built around them, with all its rigid certainties about who could love whom, who could be free, who could choose, and they rejected it. In doing so, they inscribed a question mark on history that still challenges us today. The Delacqua mansion was sold again in 1968 to a historical preservation society. During renovations, workers discovered a small space under the floorboards of the master bedroom containing a man's carpentry tools and a woman's silver hairbrush. There was no way to know when those items had been hidden there or by whom. The discovery was noted in the renovation records, and the items were put in storage where they sat until the collection was catalogued in 1972. By then they were just artifacts from another era, their significance forgotten. Some stories don't have a neat ending. They stay open like a sentence that just trails off into silence. What happened to Anne and Isaiah after they ran from Mobile? Did they find the new life they were looking for, or did they meet something darker on the road north? Did they truly choose each other freely, or were their choices inevitably twisted by the unequal world they'd come from? The official record gives no definitive answers. What we do know is that in the autumn of 1842, a woman born into privilege and a man born into bondage disappeared from Mobile, leaving behind the rubble of one life to go searching for another. Their story survives in fragments: a marriage performed by a guilt-ridden minister, a diary page about dreams that dissolve in the daylight, a tiny note in a family Bible, found peace at last. Maybe in the end, that uncertain peace is all anyone can really hope for. The freedom to write your own story, even knowing it might end mid-sentence. In the quiet rooms of the Delacqua mansion, now a museum open to the public, visitors sometimes stop in the former master bedroom and feel a strange sense of being watched. Tour guides tell them about James Delacqua, the wealthy plantation owner, and mention in passing that his widow disappeared under mysterious circumstances. What they don't say is that in this very room, a woman once wrote in her secret diary about places far from here where people might live differently. They don't tell visitors that beneath the restored floorboards, researchers once found a silver hairbrush and a set of carpenter's tools hidden side by side like a promise. Some stories are best left as whispers, echoing softly through time. The road leading away from Mobile was long and uncertain in 1842. We don't know if Anne and Isaiah traveled it together or what they found when they got to the end of it, but their disappearance left a silence in the historical record that says a lot about the world they left behind. A world that couldn't contain or put a label on what existed between them. And maybe that silence, that absence, is its own kind of proof. In 1959, a retired history professor from Tuskegee Institute named Dr. Lawrence Wilson started researching what he called lost narratives of the antebellum South. He was particularly interested in relationships that crossed the rigid racial lines of the time, relationships that were often deliberately buried in official records. One of the cases he investigated was that of Anne and Isaiah. Dr. Wilson's research notes, donated to the Alabama State Archives after his death in 1964, include interviews with elderly Mobile residents whose grandparents had actually known people in the Delacqua household. One such interview with 87-year-old Clara Wilkins gives us a perspective you'd almost never find in official documents. According to Ms. Wilkins, her grandmother had worked as a laundress for several wealthy families in Mobile, including the Delacquas. Grandma said that Miss Anne wasn't like the other ladies, Wilkins remembered. She would speak directly to the house staff, look them in the eye. Mr. Delacqua didn't like it, but she did it anyway when he wasn't watching. And she and that Isaiah, they had a way of communicating without words, a glance across the room and they understood each other. People noticed, but no one said anything while the master was alive. Dr. Wilson also found a deposition given to Mobile authorities in November of 1842 by Thomas Jenkins, a dock worker who said he had seen a white woman and a colored man boarding a merchant ship heading for New Orleans in mid-October. Jenkins said the man carried himself like no field hand he'd ever seen, and the woman kept her face hidden under a veil, but her hands were soft and pale. The authorities apparently didn't think this lead was worth following up on, maybe because by then Anne and Isaiah had already been gone for several weeks. The merchant vessel in question, the Carolina Star, had cargo records that were preserved in the New Orleans Port Authority archives. The passenger list from October 18, 1842, includes among its passengers Mr. and Mrs. Smith, with no other identifying information. Whether that very common fake name was actually hiding Anne and Isaiah is impossible to know for sure, but the timing lines up with their disappearance from Mobile. New Orleans in 1842 was a cosmopolitan port city with a complicated social structure that included a large population of free people of color, many of whom owned property and businesses. The city's French and Spanish background had created social customs very different from the rest of the American South. While still deeply unequal and shaped by racism and slavery, New Orleans had more flexible social lines and more possibilities for people who existed between the stark categories of black and white, slave and free. Church records from St. Augustine Catholic Church in New Orleans, which served a mostly black congregation, include a baptism record from February 1843 for James Smith, the infant son of Isaiah and Anne Smith. The child's godparents are listed as Marie Laveau, the famous voodoo practitioner who was also a well-respected member of the free black community, and Louis Dupré, a French merchant. This fascinating document raises the possibility that Anne was already pregnant when she and Isaiah fled Mobile, which would add another layer of urgency to why they left so quickly. If Anne and Isaiah really did set up their lives in New Orleans under the name Smith, they left almost no other traces in official records. That's probably not surprising, since they'd have had every reason to keep a very low profile. William Harrison, the man managing James Delacqua's estate, had advertised a big reward for their capture, and slave catchers were known to work in New Orleans looking for people who had escaped from plantations all across the South. A possible glimpse of their life shows up in the New Orleans Business Directory from 1845, which lists an I. Smith cabinet maker, with a workshop on Rampart Street in an area where lots of skilled free black craftsmen had their businesses. The directory notes that Smith specialized in fine French-style furniture and had recently finished commissions for several distinguished families. Isaiah's carpentry skills, mentioned in the original bill of sale when James Delacqua bought him, would have been a perfect way to support a family in New Orleans. The next documentary trace shows up in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1852. The city directory lists Isaiah Bennett, cabinet maker, with a workshop on 6th Street. While Bennett is not a rare last name, the profession matches, and Cincinnati was a well-known destination for people running from the South, sitting right across the Ohio River from Kentucky, a slave state. The city had a large free black community and was an important stop on the Underground Railroad, the network that helped enslaved people get to freedom. A deed of sale recorded in Hamilton County, Ohio in 1854, shows that Isaiah Bennett purchased a modest house on Elm Street for $650. The document describes him as a free man of color and his wife as Ann Bennett, formerly of Louisiana. This would fit a story where Ann and Isaiah first ran to New Orleans before eventually moving north as the tensions over slavery got worse and worse throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Church records from the 6th Street Methodist Episcopal Church in Cincinnati include mentions of the Bennett family attending services between 1854 and 1858. The church was known for its strong anti-slavery position and welcomed both black and white churchgoers, though seating was typically still segregated. A note in the pastor's journal from Christmas of 1856 mentions the Bennett family's generous donation of a beautifully crafted communion table made by Mr. Bennett himself. The last definitive record of Isaiah appears to be his death certificate filed in Cincinnati in July of 1859. The cause of death is listed as consumption, which was the word people used back then for tuberculosis. Isaiah was described as approximately 45 years old and worked as a cabinet maker. His wife Ann Bennett is named as his next of kin, along with their son James, aged 16, and daughter Mary, aged 14. If Mary was born after the family arrived in Cincinnati, that would fit with the timeline of when they left Mobile. Ann Bennett's death certificate from 1867 lists her as a widow of approximately 48 years of age, which would match Ann Delacqua's age at that time. The document notes that she was buried in Cincinnati's Spring Grove Cemetery, though attempts to find her actual grave in the 1960s were unsuccessful, possibly because of poor record-keeping or because she had an unmarked grave. The fate of James and Mary Bennett, the children of Isaiah and Ann, is mostly still unknown. A census record from 1870 shows a James Bennett, male, mixed race, age 27, working as a carpenter in Philadelphia. The same census lists a Mary Bennett Wilson, female, mixed race, age 25, living with her husband John Wilson, a porter, also in Philadelphia. Whether these were really Isaiah and Ann's children can't be confirmed for certain, but the ages, jobs, and locations all line up with what you'd expect. James and Mary Bennett did build lives in Philadelphia after the Civil War. They would have entered a society still very divided by race, but one where their legal status as free citizens was at least officially protected by the 14th and 15th Amendments. The story of their parents, a white woman and a formerly enslaved black man who defied the laws and social rules of their time, may have been something they chose to keep private. A family secret too dangerous or too painful to share openly. The story of Ann Delacqua and Isaiah Bennett exists in the margins of history, pieced together from scattered documents and suggestive silences in the official record. Their journey from the rigid social hierarchies of Mobile to the relative freedoms of Cincinnati traces a path across the American landscape during one of its most divided periods. Their choices, made at tremendous personal risk, challenge simple stories about the antebellum South and remind us that even inside systems of brutal oppression, individuals sometimes found ways to assert their humanity and pursue their own definitions of freedom and connection. The Delacqua Mansion in Mobile kept changing hands all through the late 1800s and early 1900s. During the Civil War, it was briefly taken over by Union officers after Mobile was captured in 1865. In the 1920s, it was used as a boarding house, its former grandeur fading as the neighborhood around it declined. By the 1950s, it had fallen into such bad shape that it was going to be torn down, until the Mobile Historical Preservation Society stepped in to save it. Today, the restored mansion serves as a museum with tours that focus mostly on its architectural importance and the general lifestyle of wealthy antebellum families. The specific story of Anne and Isaiah is rarely brought up. It gets just a brief mention in the museum's guidebook about the mysterious disappearance of James Delacroix's widow. Maybe that's fitting in its own way. Their story, after all, was one they deliberately chose to erase from public view, replacing the identities that had been imposed on them with identities of their own making. Yet traces of their presence linger in unexpected places. In 2003, during another round of renovations to the mansion, workers found a small hidden compartment behind the fireplace in the master bedroom. Inside was a leather pouch containing several items: a silver thimble engraved with the initials AB, possibly Anne Brennan, Anne's maiden name, a wooden ruler marked with the initials IB, and a folded piece of paper that had deteriorated too much to read. These items were catalogued and placed in the museum's archives, their importance noted but not highlighted in the mansion's official history. The historian Catherine Reynolds, in her 2008 book Intimate Transgressions, Forbidden Relationships in the Antebellum South, dedicates a whole chapter to Anne and Isaiah's story. She argues that their relationship wasn't some weird exception, but rather one documented example of connections that probably happened way more often than official records let on. Reynolds points out that the power imbalance built into Anne and Isaiah's positions, she as the mistress of the household, he as legally her property, even before James's death, makes any simple romantic retelling of their relationship complicated. We cannot know the nature of their feelings for each other, Reynolds writes. What we do know is that both Anne and Isaiah chose to leave behind everything familiar, she a position of relative privilege, he whatever community ties he had built even within the constraints of enslavement, to forge a life together somewhere else. Whether driven by love, practicality, or some complicated mix of both, their choice represents a rejection of the social order that defined their world. Maybe the most touching artifact connected to Anne and Isaiah's story came to light in 1969, when a descendant of the Cincinnati Bennetts donated a family Bible to the Ohio Historical Society. The Bible, printed in 1846, has a family records section with births, marriages, and deaths recorded in a careful handwriting. The first entry reads, Isaiah Bennett and Anne Bennett, united in the sight of God, September 1842. Below that are the birth dates for James Bennett, August 1843, and Mary Bennett, June 1845. What makes this document remarkable is not just what it records, but what it leaves out. There is no mention of Mobile, of Delacroix, of a previous marriage, or of enslavement. The family history starts with Isaiah and Anne's union, as if nothing existed before that moment. It is a document of self-creation, of a family writing its own origin story in defiance of the one society had written for them. On the inside cover of the Bible is an inscription in a different handwriting, presumably added by a later descendant. This Bible belonged to my great-grandparents Isaiah and Anne Bennett. They came north before the war and established our family in freedom. Whatever came before, they left behind. It is perhaps the most fitting tribute you could write for a couple who risked everything to rewrite their own story. The neighborhood in Cincinnati where Isaiah and Anne Bennett made their home has changed dramatically since the 19th century. Urban renewal projects in the 1960s tore down many of the original buildings, including where Isaiah's workshop on 6th Street used to be. The house they bought on Elm Street was replaced by an apartment building in the 1970s. No historical marker notes that they were ever there. No official commemoration acknowledges their journey. In 2017, a graduate student at the University of Cincinnati named Eliza Bennett, who believes she is a direct descendant of Isaiah and Anne, completed a dissertation titled Chosen Families: Alternative Kinship Networks in 19th Century America. In her acknowledgments, she writes, I dedicate this work to Isaiah and Anne, who chose each other against all odds and in doing so made my existence possible. The true nature of Anne and Isaiah's relationship, whether it was genuine love, mutual benefit, or some combination of factors shaped by the power dynamics of their time, is impossible to know for certain. Yet their story persists, carried forward by historians, archivists, and descendants who recognize in it something essential about America's complicated past. What is clear is that they made choices that placed them completely outside the accepted boundaries of their society, choices that required courage, desperation, or maybe both. In the end, maybe the most remarkable thing about their story isn't what they left behind, but what they created. A life together that, while definitely marked by the traumas they'd been through and the ongoing racism of 19th century America, existed on terms they had chosen for themselves. The historical record suggests they succeeded at least partially in reinventing themselves, establishing a home, raising children, carving out a small place in a new community where they were known simply as the Bennett family, cabinet maker and wife, members of the 6th Street Methodist Episcopal Church, donors of a finely crafted communion table. The story of Anne Delacroix and Isaiah Bennett reminds us that history isn't just a record of big events and massive social forces, but also of individual lives lived in the margins, of personal choices made within and against the constraints of time and place. Their journey from the Delacroix mansion on Government Street to a modest house on Elm Street traces a path across not just the physical landscape of 19th century America, but across its moral and social landscape too. As visitors walk through the restored rooms of the Delacroix mansion today, they see the carefully preserved artifacts of antebellum wealth, the imported furniture, the silver candelabra, the portraits of stern-faced men. What they don't see are the hidden spaces where Anne might have written in her secret diary, or where Isaiah might have paused to look at the carpentry tools that represented both his skill and a possible future beyond enslavement. They don't see the small compartment behind the fireplace where someone, Anne or Isaiah or both, hid those personal items found during the 2003 renovations. The silver thimble, the wooden ruler, the folded note whose contents are lost to time. These absences in the historical record, these silences and gaps, are themselves a kind of testimony. They speak to lives lived deliberately beyond the reach of documentation, to choices made to escape rather than confront an unjust system. Anne and Isaiah chose erasure as a form of freedom, disappearing from the narrative assigned to them in order to write their own. In a sense, their story is still unfolding even now, as historians, descendants, and others work to recover it from fragments and silences. Each new document discovered, each oral history recorded, each artifact preserved adds another piece to our understanding of who they were and what drove them to make such life-changing choices. The story will never be complete. Too much has been lost to time, too much was deliberately buried, but in that incompleteness lies a truth about how history is made and remade, remembered and forgotten, by those who live it and those who come after. The last known record connected to Isaiah and Anne Bennett is the death certificate for Anne filed in Cincinnati in 1867. After that, they exist only in the traces left in their children's lives, in family stories passed down through generations, and in the scattered artifacts preserved by luck or by care. Maybe this too is fitting. They sought to disappear from one story in order to show up in another, one of their own creation. In the end, they succeeded at both, becoming ghosts in one history and ancestors in another. As the sun sets over Mobile Bay, casting long shadows across the perfectly kept lawns of the Delacroix mansion, you might imagine Anne standing at an upstairs window, looking out toward the water and the world beyond. You might imagine Isaiah in the carriage house, carefully planing a piece of wood, his skilled hands making something beautiful out of raw material. You might imagine a glance exchanged, a decision made, a future glimpsed, not perfect, not without risk or pain, but their own. The road leading north from Mobile was long and uncertain in 1842. We know that Anne and Isaiah traveled it together, and we have glimpses of what they found at the end of it: a modest home, 2 children, a place in a new community, a family Bible recording their union without any reference to what came before. It is not a complete story, not a perfect resolution, but it is something precious and rare. A moment when 2 people looked at the world built around them with all its seemingly unbreakable boundaries and chose to imagine something different. In the Bennett family Bible, beneath the list of births and deaths, is a handwritten note added perhaps by Isaiah or Anne or one of their descendants. It reads simply, "Remember that you come from people who chose freedom whatever the cost." It is a statement of both history and hope, an acknowledgement of the past and a charge to the future. It is perhaps the truest legacy of Anne Delacroix and Isaiah Bennett. Not the mansion that still stands on Government Street, but the courage to imagine a different way of being in the world and the will to actually go after it.